Imagine a country where women are, well, statistically more educated than men,
Right.
and where maternal health has just suddenly jumped to this world-class level.
It's an incredible transformation, yeah.
But, and here's the really crazy part, 85% of those highly educated women do not participate in the workforce at all.
Which is just a massive economic black hole.
Exactly. Oh, and despite that black hole, this exact same country is suddenly beating fully industrialized nations in global development rankings.
Wow.
Intrigued, because you really should be. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the absolute paradox of Egypt.
It is, it's honestly a phenomenal case study. When you look at the standard metrics, Egypt presents one of the most fascinating contradictions in modern global development.
Right.
It completely shatters that linear narrative we usually expect.
Right, because we usually expect the story of human development to just be this, straight line moving up and to the right.
Yeah, exactly. The standard playbook.
A country gets richer, its people get healthier, they stay in school longer, and eventually everyone is working some high-paying job in a sprawling metropolis. It's a very clean, very comforting narrative.
It is, but it's rarely true.
Yeah, because then you get your hands on this massive stack of multidimensional human development data, which is exactly what we've done today, tracking Egypt from 1990 all the way to 2023, and that simple graph just breaks.
It shatters because the reality of development is it's a complex web of trade-offs. And if you really want to understand where the global south is heading, you can't just look at the top line numbers. You have to look at the friction between those numbers.
And the friction here is just mind-bending. Let's start with the ultimate hook for you guys listening. If you look at the standard 2023 Human Development Index,
The HDI?
right, the HDI, which is basically the United Nations gold standard for measuring how well a country is doing, Egypt sits right at rank 105.
It's right in the middle.
Exactly. It's the quintessential middle-tier developing nation. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you take that exact same index and you adjust it for planetary pressures.
Meaning you penalize countries for their carbon emissions and, their material footprint.
Right. When you do that, Egypt doesn't just bump up a few spots. The data shows it leaps 57 places.
It's a staggering jump.
Wait, let me do the math on that. If they are at rank 105 and they jump 57 places, that lands them straight into the top 50 at rank 48.
Exactly. They blast right past dozens of heavily industrialized, incredibly wealthy nations.
Which is wild. If you're trying to make sense of the world right now, you have to ask yourself, how does a middle-tier country suddenly become this global outperformer the second we view it through the lens of sustainability?
That is the central mystery we need to unpack today. Heavily developed nations, they usually have terrible planetary pressure scores.
Because of the pollution.
Right. Their wealth, historically speaking, is built on massive carbon output and just relentless material extraction. But Egypt is doing something entirely different.
But to understand if that leap in the rankings is like intentional genius or just an accidental byproduct of a broken system, we really have to look under the hood.
We do.
Which means we are not just going to read you a spreadsheet today. We are going to decode the actual mechanisms behind these numbers.
Yeah, we're going to look at an education miracle that is simultaneously losing a third of its value to inequality.
We'll dissect that labor force black hole we mentioned, the one that mathematically distorts the entire nation's wealth.
We'll look at an unbelievable world-leading triumph in health.
And finally, we will try to figure out what Egypt's unique model means for a world that is, frankly, running out of ecological runway.
But we have to start with the baseline.
Let's do it.
Because before we can talk about the paradoxes of gender dynamics or carbon footprints, we really need to establish exactly how much Egypt has grown over the last 3 decades in just raw aggregate terms.
Okay, so if you're listening and wondering how they actually calculate this baseline, think of the Human Development Index as a composite score.
It's a mashup of a few key things.
Yeah, the UN looks at 3 main things: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. They mash those together into a single number between 0 and 1. 1 is the perfect utopia, 0 is absolute collapse.
Right.
So back in 1990, Egypt's raw HDI was 0.572. But by 2023, that number had climbed to 0.754,
which represents a nearly 31.8% increase in overall human development in just over a generation.
That's a huge leap.
It is. And to put that 0.754 into context, the global average HDI for 2023 is roughly 0.756.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so mathematically, Egypt has essentially caught up to the global mean.
They closed a massive gap. But, I'm looking at the historical trajectory mapped out in the data, and
Yeah.
what really strikes me is the lack of volatility.
What do you mean?
Well, you expect developing nations to have these wild boom and bust cycles, especially in a region that has seen immense political and economic upheaval over the last 30 years.
All right, the Arab Spring regime changes.
Exactly. But this line on the graph is just a persistent, stubborn upward push. Even during 2020 and 2021, at the absolute height of the global pandemic, Egypt's HDI barely wavered compared to the massive dips we saw on the global average.
That resilience is actually a crucial characteristic of their specific development model. They maintained their baseline when the rest of the world was basically sliding backward.
Yeah.
And the most tangible human impact of this climb is found in the life expectancy data.
Oh, this card is fascinating.
In 1990, the life expectancy at birth in Egypt was 62.5 years. By 2023, it jumped to 71.6 years.
That is almost an entire extra decade of life added to the average citizen, though it is still sitting slightly below the global average of 73.4 years.
It is, but we have to dissect that average because the gender breakdown reveals a very specific narrative here.
Okay, break that down for us.
So by 2023, women in Egypt are expected to live to about 73.8 years, while men are expected to live to 69.4 years.
Right, but women outliving men is a pretty standard demographic trend globally, right? I mean, biologically and socially, that gap exists almost everywhere.
Yes, the gap itself is normal,
Yeah.
but it's what's driving the rapid increase in the female life expectancy that is truly anomalous in this data set.
Okay.
If you want to see the real triumph of the Egyptian healthcare system, you have to dig past the general life expectancy and look at a deeply specific metric hidden inside the gender inequality index, the maternal mortality ratio.
Yes. This measures how many women die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births. And I have to admit, when I first looked at this specific column of data, I thought there was a typo.
I know, the scale of the change is just difficult to process without historical context.
Right. So let's paint that picture for everyone. In 1990, out of every 100,000 live births in Egypt, 124 resulted in the death of the mother.
Which is 124 deaths per 100,000 is a systemic public health crisis.
It's terrifying.
It wasn't just a matter of a few underfunded hospitals. A number that high indicates a severe nationwide lack of medical infrastructure.
Like, what does that actually mean on the ground in 1990?
It means pregnant women in rural areas had zero access to prenatal care. It means no emergency obstetric access, high rates of infection, and a heavy reliance on untrained birth attendants. In 1990, giving birth in many parts of Egypt was a highly dangerous gamble.
But then you track that data point decade by decade. By 2000, it was down to 79. By 2010, it dropped to 38.
It just keeps halving.
Yeah. And by 2023, that number collapsed to just 16.8.
That's a drop of over 86%.
It's an astronomical victory.
Yeah.
And to give that 16.8 a sense of scale, the global average for maternal mortality right now is roughly 216 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Let's really emphasize that. The global average is 216. Egypt is at 16.8.
That's insane.
It means their maternal safety is almost 13 times better than the global average.
Wow.
They aren't just doing well for a middle-tier nation. They are operating at a level of safety that rivals, and in some cases even exceeds, highly developed Western nations.
Okay, I have to stop and pose a hypothesis here, because this doesn't just happen by accident.
No, definitely
You
not.
don't just shave 86% off a mortality rate by running a few public service announcements. How does a country with a middling GDP and a massive dispersed rural population pull off a logistical miracle like that?
Well, what's your guess?
I'm assuming it required a total rewiring of how the state interacts with its citizens, like a massive infrastructure play.
Your hypothesis is spot on. It required a complete systemic overhaul, and it was primarily driven by highly targeted, aggressive public health policies.
So what did they actually do?
Starting in the late 1990s and really accelerating through the 2000s, the Egyptian Ministry of Health didn't just build fancy hospitals in Cairo, they decentralized maternal care.
Meaning they brought the care to the people.
Exactly. It looks like deploying thousands of mobile health units to rural villages in Upper Egypt.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It looks like a massive national campaign to train traditional midwives and actually integrate them into the formal medical system rather than fighting against them.
So they utilize the existing cultural infrastructure.
Yes. They made prenatal care virtually free and highly accessible, but most importantly, they focused on physical infrastructure,
Paving roads.
paving roads, establishing reliable emergency transport protocols so that when a woman in a remote village suffered a hemorrhage during labor, she could actually reach a surgical facility in time.
So it's fundamentally a logistics triumph as much as a medical one?
Precisely. They recognize that maternal mortality isn't just about medicine, it's about time and access. By solving the access problem, they fundamentally fortified the baseline of human survival.
It makes me think of a massive ship that's trying to cross an ocean.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So the ship is the country, right?
Yeah.
And it's trying to sail toward modernization.
Yeah.
But back in 1990, there was a massive gaping hole in the hull, that 124 maternal mortality rate.
Yeah.
If you were losing that many women at the very moment they are creating the next generation, you are taking on water fast. Before you can upgrade the ship's engine, before you can build nicer cabins or invest in fancy navigation systems, you have to stop the ship from sinking.
That's a great way to look at it.
By dropping that rate to 16.8, Egypt patched the most critical leak in their demographic haul.
It is a good analogy, but let's push it even further. Because patching that hull has a profound ripple effect across every other metric we are going to discuss today.
Also,
When women survive childbirth at higher rates, it doesn't just increase the life expectancy average, it stabilizes families. It ensures children aren't orphaned. And it allows women to look beyond mere survival and actually invest in their own long-term human capital.
which perfectly bridges us to the next massive shift in the data. You secure basic survival, the leak is patched. The logical next question is, what happens to these children who are born safely and the mothers who survive? How is the state developing their minds?
And this is where we enter the realm of education, which is where the data starts to reveal a profound, yet highly fractured, miracle.
On the surface, the aggregate numbers are incredible.
They really are.
If you look at expected years of schooling, which, for you listening, is the UN's way of predicting how many years of education a child entering the school system today will likely receive.
Right, it's a projection.
Yeah. The historical baseline in Egypt was grim. Back in 1990, women were expected to get about 8.1 years of schooling. Men were expected to get 10.1.
Which tells you a lot about the structural realities of 1990 Egypt, a 2-year gender gap combined with an overall average that barely gets a citizen through middle school.
Right.
That reflects an economy that did not structurally require or support widespread long-term education. It was an economy highly reliant on manual labor, agriculture, and informal trade.
But jump to 2023. The expected years of schooling for women has skyrocketed from 8.1 to 13.0 years. For men, it went from 10.1 to 13.2.
They essentially added 5 full years of expected education for women.
And they completely erased the gender gap. I mean, 13.0 versus 13.2 is statistical parity. Both boys and girls entering the system today are expected to complete high school and at least step foot into higher education.
Yes, and that 13.1 overall average actually surpasses the current global average of 13.0.
They beat the world average. But expectations are just predictions.
Exactly. If we want to see the reality of what has already happened, we have to look at mean years of schooling.
And this is different how?
This metric measures the actual realized years of education achieved by the population aged 25 and older.
Ah, okay. This is the stat that genuinely made me sit up and reread the page.
It's quite the flip.
In 1990, the mean years of schooling for an adult woman in Egypt was just 4.4 years. Men were at 5.9.
Very low for both, but definitely tilted toward men.
Right. Now, jump to 2023. The mean years of schooling for adult men is 9.72. But for women, it is 10.67 years.
Let's really absorb that for a second.
In just over 30 years, adult women went from having functionally no formal education, 4.4 years is barely basic literacy, to actually surpassing adult men in actual years of schooling achieved.
They didn't just close the gap, they crossed it.
It is a remarkable societal shift.
Yeah.
You are looking at a generation of Egyptian women who are not only surviving childbirth at world-leading rates, but who are mathematically more educated than their male counterparts.
Yeah, and if you stop the analysis right here, you would conclude that Egypt is a textbook utopia of multidimensional human development. But we aren't stopping here.
We can't.
Because if there is one thing we know about looking at national averages, it's that an average is often a very comforting lie. It hides the extremes.
Exactly. And the United Nations knows this too, which is why they created the IHDI.
The Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
So if you're trying to picture how this works, the standard HDI assumes that all the wealth, all the health, and all the education in a country is distributed perfectly equally to every single citizen. It just takes the total and divides it by the population.
Which is obviously never true in reality.
Never. But the IHDI acts as a penalty system. It looks at how unequally those things are distributed, and it slices points off the country's score accordingly.
It measures the loss in potential development due to hoarding or systemic marginalization. And when we apply this inequality adjustment to Egypt's 2023 data, the story takes a dark turn.
It really does.
Their standard HDI drops from 0.754 all the way down to 0.582.
That is a brutal downgrade.
It means Egypt loses 22.8% of its total human development progress entirely due to internal inequality.
Wow.
Over a fifth of their national progress basically vanishes when you account for how it is actually distributed on the ground.
And the specific breakdown of that loss is what really breaks my brain. We can look at exactly where that 22.8% is bleeding from.
Let's hear it.
The inequality loss in income is about 16.2%. The inequality loss in life expectancy is 10.4%. But the inequality loss in education is a staggering 36.9%.
Which forces a very uncomfortable realization.
It does. Because I'm really trying to square this circle here. We just spent 10 minutes marveling at how expected years of schooling jumped to 13 years, and how adult women have actually surpassed adult men, reaching over 10.6 years of actual schooling.
Right.
If the national averages are rising so beautifully and women are beating men, how on earth is education inequality causing a near 37% loss in the country's development index? How can both of these mathematical realities exist at the same time?
It comes down to the mechanics of extreme polarization. Let's create a simplified model for you. Imagine a room with 10 people in it.
Okay, I've got my 10 people.
If 5 of those people are doctors with 20 years of schooling, and the other 5 people have literally 0 years of schooling and cannot read a single word, the average years of schooling for that room is 10 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see it. If I just look at the average from outside the room, I say, wow, everyone in there has a solid high school education. But the reality is half the room is highly elite and half the room is entirely marginalized.
Exactly. What that 36.9% inequality loss tells us is that Egypt's educational average is masking a massive, deep demographic divide.
So who are the doctors in this scenario?
You have a highly educated, likely urban, upper and middle class. These are folks concentrated in cities like Cairo and Alexandria. Both men and women in these demographics are achieving university degrees, pursuing master's programs, and they are driving that national average through the roof.
But simultaneously, there is a massive demographic that is still being left almost entirely behind.
Yes, likely in rural Upper Egypt or in lower-income urban neighborhoods. In these demographics, girls and boys might be dropping out after just a few years to work in informal labor or agriculture.
So they never even see a high school.
No, the data is telling us that while the ceiling of education in Egypt has been raised to world-class heights, the floor has barely moved for millions of people.
It is basically a tale of two countries living within the same borders. The education miracle is absolutely real for a huge segment of the population, but it is functionally inaccessible to another huge segment.
And this is why we must always look at the IHDI. It proves that raising the average does not automatically equate to raising the marginalized. That 36.9% loss is the mathematical manifestation of the people who cannot access the miracle.
Okay, let's follow the data to its logical, or rather illogical conclusion. Let's focus on the women who did get access to that miracle, the doctors in our metaphorical room.
Okay, the highly educated cohort.
Yeah. You have this booming generation of healthy, highly educated women. The maternal mortality threat is virtually eliminated, the universities are full, and these women are outpacing men in earning degrees.
Right.
If you are analyzing this as an economist, you would expect these highly educated women to be absolutely dominating the modern Egyptian economy.
Human capital theory dictates exactly that. If you invest massively in educating a demographic, that demographic will inevitably enter the workforce, drive innovation, start businesses, and push the gross domestic product upward.
It's the whole point of the investment.
Exactly. Education is supposed to translate into economic participation.
But when we look at the data for Egypt's labor force, we hit what might be the single most jarring contradiction in this entire data set.
It is a devastating statistic.
Let's look at the female labor force participation rate. This metric measures the percentage of women aged 15 and older who are either currently working or actively looking for work. In 2023, the female labor force participation rate in Egypt is just 15.0%.
15%. Let that really sink in for a moment.
Just to contrast that, the global average for female participation is around 47%, and the male labor force participation rate inside Egypt is 69.2%.
It's an enormous gap.
But here is the kicker, the thing that makes this a true paradox, that 15% isn't just low, it has actually fallen over the last 30 years.
We really need to trace this timeline carefully because it is the key to understanding the modern Egyptian economy.
Okay, back in our starting year, 1990, female labor force participation was 26.7%. Through the 90s and the 2000s, it hovered in the low 20s. Even as recently as 2010, it was at 23%.
Right.
But over the last decade, the exact same decade where female education averages reached their highest point in the nation's history, the labor participation rate fell off a cliff. By 2019, it was down to 15.6. It hit 14.4 during the pandemic in 2020, and it is flatlined at 15.0% today.
It is an almost perfect inverse relationship. As their education went up, their economic participation went down.
And because 85% of adult women are entirely absent from the workforce, it creates an absolute black hole in the income data.
It does.
We see this vividly in the Gender Development Index, GDI. Egypt's overall GDI score is a dismal 0.895, placing it in the very bottom tier globally.
So the GDI compares the human development of women directly against men. And the reason Egypt's score is so terrible is almost entirely due to the income column.
The numbers are shocking. In 2023, the estimated gross national income, or GNI per capita, for women in Egypt is around $5,077.
And for men?
For men, it is $27,143.
Men are generating economic output at a multiplier of 5.3 times that of women.
5.3 times.
And to put that in a global perspective, the worldwide average female GNI is roughly $14,943. The average Egyptian woman is generating only about a third of the global average for women, despite being more highly educated than the global average.
Okay, I have to push back here. We need to explain why this is happening. The data says they have degrees. The data says they are healthy. Why aren't they working? Are they just choosing not to? Is this purely a cultural preference where educated women simply prefer to stay home?
While cultural norms regarding caregiving and domestic roles certainly play a part, blaming this solely on culture is an analytical cop-out.
Why is that?
Because culture doesn't cause a participation rate to drop from 26% to 15% in a single decade. Culture moves slowly. To understand the mechanism driving this sudden drop, we have to look at macroeconomics, specifically the structural shift in how Egypt employs its people.
Okay, break down the mechanism for me. What actually happened?
Historically, going back to the 1960s and through the 80s, the Egyptian state was the primary employer of educated citizens. If you got a university degree, the government essentially guaranteed you a job in the public sector.
Like as a teacher or a bureaucrat?
Exactly. State administrators, healthcare workers.
And I'm assuming the public sector was highly attractive for women.
Immensely attractive. Public sector jobs offered predictable hours, guaranteed maternity leave, state-sponsored childcare, and physical safety. It allowed women to balance those cultural expectations of family care with actual economic participation.
Ah, so this is why female participation was higher in 1990. The state was absorbing the educated women.
Exactly.
So what broke?
The national economy shifted. Under immense pressure from international lenders like the IMF, Egypt had to undergo severe structural adjustment programs starting in the 1990s, and those really accelerated into the 2000s and 2010s.
So they had to cut government spending.
Right, which meant imposing massive hiring freezes in the public sector. The state could no longer afford to just guarantee jobs to graduates.
So the safe, predictable jobs just vanished.
Exactly. And the explicit goal of these economic reforms was to shift job creation to the private sector. Let the free market handle it. But here is the structural failure. The private sector in Egypt was not, and largely still is not, built to accommodate women.
How so? Give me an example of the friction they face.
Well, private sector jobs often demand grueling, unpredictable hours that clash with inflexible societal expectations that women must handle all domestic duties. The private sector is notoriously resistant to paying for maternity leave. Furthermore, taking a private sector job often requires commuting long distances. And if the public transportation infrastructure is unreliable or unsafe for women, the cost of simply getting to work outweighs the benefit of the salary.
This makes perfect sense. It's a structural squeeze. The government stopped hiring, And the private sector essentially erected invisible barriers to entry.
Precisely. Economists refer to this phenomenon as capability idle.
Capability idle. I like that term.
Think about the immense financial resources a nation spends to educate a citizen from kindergarten through a university degree. It is a massive investment of state funds, infrastructure, and human time. Egypt has successfully generated a massive reservoir of human capital.
But they aren't using it.
Right. The structural realities of their market are preventing that capacity from entering the formal economy.
It's like, okay, imagine a country decides it wants to dominate the global logistics industry.
Right.
So they spend billions of dollars, they hire the best engineers, and they spend 30 years building a massive fleet of state-of-the-art, high-performance delivery trucks. These trucks represent the highly educated women in our data.
Perfect.
But then, after building this incredible fleet, the country simply refuses to build any highways. They don't pave the roads, they don't build fueling stations, they don't create traffic laws.
It's actually more than just not building the highways. It's that the existing roads are full of toll booths that only charge the trucks, not the standard cars.
Exactly. The infrastructure is actively hostile to them. So what happens? The entire fleet of multi-million-dollar trucks just sits locked in the garage, idling. The capability is there, the engineering is flawless, but the mechanism to actually utilize it is absent.
And when 85% of your working-age female population is outside the formal labor force, that is not just a gender issue, it is a macroeconomic tragedy.
Yeah, it hurts everyone.
The nation is bearing the full financial cost of educating its population, but it is willingly forfeiting the economic dividend of that education. You cannot maximize your GDP if you are essentially running a marathon on one leg.
It is a phenomenal waste of potential. But, this leads me to another question.
What's that?
If you are a listener trying to visualize this society,
Yeah.
you have a population of women who are highly educated, they're living long, healthy lives, but they're entirely locked out of the economic sphere. The trucks are in the garage. Usually, economic power and political power are two sides of the same coin. If you don't have a voice in the economy, you don't have a voice in the government. Are these women completely marginalized politically?
If you follow traditional political science models, you would assume yes. Economic exclusion usually guarantees political irrelevance.
But the data strikes again, and it reveals a shocking counter-narrative. We need to look at another UN index here, the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII.
Specifically, the metric tracking the female share of seats in the national parliament.
Yes. This is perhaps the most abrupt, vertical shift in the entire data set.
It really is.
For decades, the political representation of women in Egypt was basically a flat line. From 1990 all the way to 2015, a span of 25 years. The percentage of parliamentary seats held by women hovered miserably between 1.9% and 2.1%.
A mathematical rounding error in the legislature. They were functionally invisible in the halls of power.
But then, look at the data starting in 2016. It doesn't just tick upward, it goes parabolic.
Yeah.
In 2016, the female share of parliament jumps to 14.9%, and then it keeps climbing. By 2020, it rockets to 22.8%, and it has stabilized there, sitting at 22.7% in the 2023 data.
We are talking about a tenfold increase in political representation in a window of roughly 5 years.
Just to put that 22.7% in perspective, the global average for female parliamentary representation is 26.5%. So Egypt went from being the absolute bottom of the global barrel to suddenly knocking on the door of the global average. How does that happen so fast?
Well, we must be very clear here. As analysts looking strictly at the data, we are not here to judge the political mechanisms or the governance models that cause this. We are simply observing the structural reality.
Right, just the facts.
And the reality is that this spike was not organic. It was engineered. Following constitutional revisions and electoral law changes in the mid-2010s, Egypt implemented mandatory quotas requiring a certain percentage of parliamentary seats to be allocated to women.
So the state basically recognized the total absence of women in power and essentially forced a market correction in the legislature.
Precisely. And while political scientists can debate the nuance of quota systems all day, the mathematical reality on our spreadsheet is a tectonic shift. Going from 2% to nearly 23% alters the fundamental math of how the United Nations views Egypt.
This is what I want to dive into because the math of the Gender Inequality Index seems completely counterintuitive to me at first glance.
How's that?
Well, the GII measures how much a country loses due to gender inequality. A low score is good. It means low inequality. Egypt's GII score is 0.398, ranking them 106 globally. But that score of 0.398 is actually better than the global average of 0.455.
Yes, Egypt technically outperforms the world average in gender inequality, according to this specific UN metric.
But how is that possible? We just spent 20 minutes talking about how 85% of women are excluded from the labor force and men earn 5 times as much money. How can their inequality index be better than the global average?
It is brilliant index mechanics. You have to understand how the UN weights the GII formula. The index measures 3 dimensions: reproductive health, political empowerment, and the labor market. Think of the formula like a giant scale.
Okay, I'm picturing a scale.
We already established that Egypt has a catastrophic labor market score for women because of that 15% participation rate. That puts a massive heavy weight on the bad side of the scale.
Right.
But remember our sinking ship analogy from earlier?
The maternal mortality drop from 124 down to 16.8.
Exactly. Egypt completely solved the reproductive health metric. Their maternal safety is 13 times better than the global average. That puts an enormous weight on the good side of the scale.
Oh, I'm starting to see it.
Now add to that health victory this sudden 10x multiplier in political empowerment due to the parliamentary quotas.
Wow, okay. The sheer mathematical force of the health victory and the political quota is actively offsetting the dismal labor participation numbers.
Precisely. The formula allows success in health and politics to mathematically balance out the failure in economics. This is why Egypt's overall GII score is actually quite impressive.
That is fascinating, but it also really highlights the danger of relying purely on a top-line index score.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine you are a researcher reading a summary report, and you see Egypt's GII is better than the global average. You might assume everything is perfectly fine. But the reality is a society in a profound, incredibly uneven state of transition.
It's a paradox.
Yeah. On one hand, maternal health is world-class, education is at parity, and women control nearly a quarter of the national legislature. On the other hand, the vast majority of women have virtually no access to personal economic independence. It's like the data is pulling the country in two completely opposite directions at the exact same time.
It is the ultimate developmental paradox. It forces us to reconsider what empowerment actually looks like on the ground. Can a demographic be considered truly empowered if they have political representation and long life expectancies, but no ability to earn their own capital?
That is a question that entire sociology departments could spend decades debating.
Definitely.
But we have one more massive contradiction to explore today, and this one takes us from the internal dynamics of Egypt all the way out to the global planetary level.
It is time to revisit the hook from the beginning of our deep dive.
Yes. Let's talk about the green superiority. Let's look at the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
So to set the context here, the United Nations realized a few years ago that the standard HDI was fundamentally flawed because it basically rewarded countries for destroying the Earth.
Right. If a country burns 1 billion tons of coal to build 1,000 factories and make everyone rich, their standard HDI goes up. But the planet suffers.
Exactly. So they created the PHDI as a reality check. It takes a country's standard development score and penalizes it based on 2 things: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita. Basically, how much pollution are you pumping into the air and how many raw resources are you ripping out of the ground to sustain your lifestyle?
Right. Every country takes a discount or a penalty. The global average PHDI is about 0.680, meaning the world as a whole takes a pretty significant penalty for its pollution.
But let's look at Egypt.
Let's do it.
In the standard HDI, Egypt is ranked 105th, a solid middle-tier nation. But when the UN applies the planetary pressure penalty to the whole world, heavily developed nations plummet down the rankings because their wealth is built on massive carbon extraction.
Like the United States, European nations, the Gulf states, they all take massive hits.
But Egypt barely takes a hit at all.
Their PHDI value is 0.726. The difference between their standard HDI and their planetary adjusted HDI is incredibly small. The data shows they only lose about 3.7% of their score.
And because they hold their ground while everyone else falls, Egypt gets that massive 57 rank boost we talked about. They jump into the top 50, hitting rank 48.
Which is staggering. Let's look at the exact environmental metrics to see why. In 2023, Egypt's carbon dioxide emissions per capita are 2.39 tons. The global average is almost double that, at 4.54 tons per capita.
And their material footprint is similarly low. Egypt represents a highly fascinating model. They have achieved relatively high human development, meaning long life expectancies, excellent maternal health, high average education without exacting a devastating toll on the Earth.
They managed to grow human capacity without triggering massive ecological destruction.
It is a remarkable achievement.
It makes me think of a high school chemistry class.
Okay, lay it on me.
So you have the straight-A students at the top of the class. These are the highly developed, wealthy nations. They get perfect grades on their science projects. But in the process of building their projects, they completely trashed the laboratory. They burned the desks, they shattered the beakers, they released toxic gas into the room.
They achieved the result by destroying the environment.
Right. Then you have Egypt. Egypt is the student who gets a decent, solid B- grade, ranked 105th. But Egypt is the only student in the class who managed to build their science project without burning down the laboratory. When the teacher finally decides to factor lab safety into the final grade, suddenly that B- student shoots way up the curve.
It is a compelling analogy, but if we are being rigorous analysts, we have to push this analogy further and ask the uncomfortable why.
What do you mean?
We have to ask, is the student keeping the lab safe because they are a visionary genius who invented eco-friendly chemistry? Or is the lab safe simply because the student couldn't afford the explosive chemicals in the first place?
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
We have to ask if Egypt's low planetary pressure is the result of intentional, visionary green policy, like massive investments in solar arrays and wind farms, or is it an accidental byproduct of the very economic paradox we just spent an hour dissecting?
You're saying the carbon footprint is low because the economy isn't fully industrialized.
Exactly. If 85% of your educated female population is sitting at home, locked out of the workforce, they are commuting. They aren't driving cars to work. They aren't operating heavy machinery in factories.
Yeah.
The capability idle that is devastating their economic output, the trucks locked in the garage, is the exact same mechanism that is keeping their carbon emissions artificially low.
That is the ultimate double-edged sword. The lack of industrial, labor-intensive growth is acting as an accidental climate shield. If the trucks are in the garage, they aren't burning gas.
This is the central tension of sustainable development for the entire global South. Can a country like Egypt activate that idle engine? Can they fix their labor market, put those millions of women to work, build the factories, and expand the infrastructure without losing their PHDI advantage?
Because if they just follow the traditional Western path of development, the moment they integrate those women and industrialize, their carbon emissions will skyrocket and they will plummet right back down the planetary rankings.
Precisely. And this tightrope walk is further complicated when we look at the final piece of data in our stack, the MPI, or the Multidimensional Poverty Index.
Right, because up to this point, we've been talking about averages and indices, but the MPI measures acute multidimensional poverty on the ground.
Yes, the lived reality.
According to the 2014 data point we have, Egypt's multidimensional poverty rate is actually incredibly low, sitting at just 5.2%.
A 5.2% poverty rate is a massive victory for a developing nation of over 100 million people. But the MPI doesn't just count who is poor. It measures how they are poor. It breaks poverty down into 10 indicators across health, education, and living standards.
And when you look at the breakdown for that 5.2%, two major factors drive it. Nutrition accounts for 33.1% of the poverty index, and school dropouts account for 20.8%.
Which perfectly validates the inequality data we discussed earlier. The national education average is high, but the MPI shows us exactly who is falling through the cracks. The 20% driven by dropouts are the kids in rural areas who can't access that 13-year education miracle.
It shows that while the baseline of survival is strong, the floor is still incredibly fragile for the most marginalized citizens.
Exactly. The challenge for Egypt isn't just about raising the ceiling anymore. It's about patching these micro-deficits in nutrition and early education so the floor doesn't collapse.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis. We have looked at an absolute mountain of data today.
We really have.
We've tracked 33 years of life, death, schooling, missing labor, political quotas, and carbon footprints. To distill this massive socioeconomic puzzle into actionable insights for you guys listening, we have identified three clear, critical takeaways. The three keys for Egypt's future development.
Key number 1, activate the idle engine. Egypt has spent 30 years an immense national treasure securing a massive education dividend.
Right, they patched the maternal health leaks and successfully educated a generation of women to a level higher than men.
Now, the state and the private sector must work together to convert that human capital into actual economic growth. They must break down the structural and infrastructural barriers keeping the 15% female labor force out of the market. They have to build the highways for the trucks they already built.
I love that. Key number 2, bridge the inequality gap. We've seen today that national averages can be very comforting lies. The country must urgently address the 36.9% loss in education parity, highlighted by the IHDI, and the dropout rates highlighted by the MPI.
They have to ensure that the miracle of schooling isn't just a privilege for the urban upper class in Cairo, but a reality for the marginalized demographics currently dragging the distribution down. They must raise the floor to meet the ceiling.
And key number 3, maintain the green lead. As Egypt inevitably grows economically, as they seek to activate that idle labor force and increase their GDP, they must find a way to decouple that economic growth from carbon emissions.
They must transition from an accidental climate shield to an intentional green economy, maintaining their PHDI advantage without trading their ecological soul for gross domestic product.
It is a massive, incredibly delicate balancing act. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought, something we haven't explicitly said, but that the data seems to be whispering if you listen closely enough.
If we connect all these disparate dots, the world-class maternal health, the educational parity, the low carbon footprint.
Yeah, if a country can achieve high human capacity, meaning their citizens are healthy, educated, and living long lives, without heavily industrializing its way to a massive ecological disaster, does Egypt actually represent the prototype for the future?
It is a profound question. In a 21st century world that is now strictly constrained by climate limits, the old path to development is dead. You cannot just burn endless coal and extract endless resources to get rich anymore. The planet simply cannot sustain another billion people living a hyper-industrialized, Western-style carbon lifestyle.
So what happens to the global order if the middle-tier nations, the ones currently figuring out how to build human capacity without burning down the lab, are the only ones structurally capable of surviving the ecological limits of the future? Is the paradox of Egypt, with all its friction and uneven progress, actually the blueprint for tomorrow's sustainable world?
It challenges everything we think we know about progress. The data clearly shows us that development is not a straight upward line on a graph. It is a complex, messy web of trade-offs, idle engines, and hidden victories.
It certainly is. Keep looking past the averages, keep searching for the hidden paradoxes, and as always, keep questioning the numbers behind the narratives. Because sometimes, when you step into the murky, contradictory waters of human development, the broken metrics show you exactly what you need to see.